Okay, so we've got sine, we've got cosine. Hopefully it's starting to make some sense what those mean. There are 4 other trig functions, and then we'll have the complete list and you won't have to learn any more. But I think I want to take some time right now to define the other 4. So the first one on my list, let me zoom in a little, is tangent. And tangent gets abbreviated TAN, and all the trig functions input t, so we're going to plug in an arc length or an angle, and what tangent gives us back is sine over cosine, which in terms of the unit circle, it's going to be y over x. So it's fine to think about it as y over x, but do be aware that later on in the quarter, we're going to want to be able to generalize to any circle, or more like it is any triangle. Right now, the triangle that we're working with is always stuck within the unit circle, so it's always got a radius of 1. So that x over y works beautifully. If that radius is 1, or if your triangle has a hypotenuse that's not 1, the y over x part won't work quite so well. So if you just memorize it as sine over cosine for now, it'll save you having to kind of re-memorize later on. And then if we're getting that sine is y and cosine is x, it should be really easy to make that jump. Okay, so just to mention, tangent on the unit circle, one really nice way to visualize that is it gives you the slope of that line that you draw to get to your point. So when you draw that line from the origin to your point, its slope is y over x. So that's a nice way to visualize it. The other 3, I tend to just think of in terms of how they're related back to these first 3. So sine, cosine, and tangent are the most used and most important for what we're going to be doing this quarter and in calculus. But cotangent is next on my list. It's abbreviated COT. As I said, they all input t values. It gives us cosine t over sine t, which is x over y on the unit circle. And I'm even going to give you one more. It's the reciprocal of tangent. So this is how I tend to remember this one, although there is a little bit of funniness with domain. Sine and cosine, they don't have any domain problems, but we'll run into seeing that some of these other ones that are defined as a fraction, they can have domain problems. So there's a little bit of funniness where cotangent t and 1 over tangent t disagree at certain locations, but mostly that's okay to think about. Okay, and then the other 2 are secant, which is abbreviated SEC, and it is 1 over cosine t, or on the unit circle, 1 over your x value. And then last one is cosecant, abbreviated CSC. That always seems like kind of a funny one to me. And it is the reciprocal of sine of t, or 1 over y. So again, I recommend that you memorize these 4 all in terms of their relationship to sine and cosine, because that will carry through anything you do. The y over x, x over y, 1 over x, 1 over y, those are beautiful on the unit circle. They won't be true necessarily when we're looking at triangles that don't have a hypotenuse of 1 or a circle that doesn't have a radius 1. So mostly they'll serve you well, but I would stick with the sine and cosine. Okay, so what we've got here is basically your first set of trig identities, and there are gobs of trig identities out there. We're going to pick out a few of the most important, and they're going to be on your list of things to memorize. And then later in the quarter, we'll add a little bit to that, and then we'll also add a chunk that we're going to work with, but you don't have to memorize. We'll give you a formula sheet. And then I want you to be aware that there's tons and tons more. You can find all these interesting relationships between the different trig functions. But what we've got right here are the quotient identities, those top 2, and the reciprocal identities, and this I think would count as well as a reciprocal identity. You don't need to remember what they're called. That's not a big deal at all, but you do need to memorize these. So this is a great place for flashcards. Make flashcards for these, get them memorized as soon as possible. We will be using them constantly, so I think they'll stick fairly soon. But there are a few chunks of just straight some memorization you're going to have to do in trig, and this is one of them. And I want to throw in one more identity before I wrap this video up. We mentioned earlier that we still have the x squared plus y squared equals 1 relationship when we're on the unit circle. And now that we've defined the relationships between x and y and sine and cosine, we can actually rewrite that in terms of trig functions. So if x really is the same as cosine of t, and y is really the same as sine of t, then we can fill those into the formula. And this is, I think I said it earlier, this is our Pythagorean identity. This is it fully written out. So it's based on that right triangle that fits within the unit circle. And there's a little bit of notation play that can happen here as well. You'll see the note down below. When we're writing trig functions, we often have powers involved. So we have kind of a shorthand. It saves us some parentheses. We put the power right next to the trig function name. So when you see cosine squared of t, that means that you're taking the cosine of t and squaring it. And when you see sine squared of t, that means you're taking the sine of t and then squaring it. So I kind of like this notation because it is a little cleaner and neater to write, but I kind of hate it as well because it causes some confusion. It causes some confusion about order of operations, what's really going on there. And then also there's this whole business with function notation where we say to be really careful. Make sure I'm writing what I mean to. There we go. That if you want to say f to the negative first power, you've got to do it the first way, this parentheses way. That's f to the negative first power, or 1 over f. If you put the negative first power right on the f, that means f inverse. And that's going to be true for trig functions as well. If we put a negative first power there, we don't actually mean negative first power, we mean inverse. So there's a little confusion with inverses. Just be really careful if you're trying to do a negative first power, and be really aware of what the order of operations actually is there. You'd find the cosine of t and then you'd square it. You'd find the sine of t and then you'd square it. Otherwise, you're going to see this a ton, so we're going to do it, and it is a little nicer to write. Okay, so you now have your quotient identities for tangent and cotangent, your reciprocal identities for secant and cosecant, and your first Pythagorean identity. We can actually write other Pythagorean identities for other pairs of functions, but this one will do us for now. This will be perfect. It'll get us a long ways. So work on making sure you have all of those memorized. Okay, thanks for watching.